Welcome everyone to day 30 and chapter 26. In chapter 26 we're going to talk about the phylogeny and the tree of life. In this first objective and the first podcast we're going to define some basic terms that are going to be important for this chapter, and we'll also look at some basic phylogenetic trees and try to understand how to interpret them and some features of the trees. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first definition is taxonomy. Taxonomy is the ordered division and naming of organisms. So simply put, this is the way scientists name organisms and how we divide them up into groups. Phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a group of related species. Systematics. We can define this by saying classifies organisms and determines their evolutionary relationships. And the last word we want to identify right now is cladistics. The use of phylogeny as the basis for systematics. The next two things we need to talk about are how scientists name things and how we order them. Let's begin with the term binomial nomenclature. As your book describes, there are many common names for animals and plants, and these common names are fine in our daily lives. However, when scientists want to know specifically what kind of organism we're going to refer to, we always use the Latin name of that organism. So we always use Latin. And the Latin name, we only refer to that in what we call the genus and species part of that organism's classification. And the genus and species are always written with the genus first and capitalized, and the species second, not capitalized. So let's make sure that S is clearly a small s. In addition, we always italicize it. And the reason we do that is just because we always italicize any Latin words. It's really difficult to write in italicized, so anytime we are handwriting genus and species, we underline them. So if on an exam you're asked to indicate the genus and species of humans, you would want to write Homo sapiens, for instance, where the first letter H of Homo is capitalized and the first letter of sapiens is lowercase. So of course this is humans. I'm going to write down a couple other examples for you. Bufo, terrestrius, And this is the southern toad. Some of them make a little bit more sense. For instance, falco, peregrinus is the peregrine falcon. So that makes more sense. The common mouse is just musculus. This is just our common mouse. And we shouldn't forget to underline these so we get full credit. Okay, so these are just some examples. You don't need to memorize these. We're not going to ask you to list 5 genus and species with their common names. These are just some examples to give you an idea of how this is used. However, you should be familiar and comfortable recognizing how a genus and species name is written. For instance, if we give you 4 or 5 choices and have different genuses and species names and ask you which one of these is written correctly, you should be able to identify that it is the one that has the genus capitalized and the species lowercase, and both of them italicized or underlined. Now, scientists continue to further classify species and genuses into larger groups, and we call this the hierarchical classification. You can think of species here as the most specific way to classify an organism. And then several species can be grouped into the genus. And then several genuses can be grouped into a family. And then several families can be grouped into an order. And then several orders can be grouped into a class. And then several classes can be grouped into a phylum. Several phylums can be grouped into kingdom. And then kingdoms can be further broken down into domains. We were introduced to these last two in the first chapter. And so let's remind you what these are. The domains, I'm going to write them up here, are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. You need to memorize these 3 domains. You may have at one time learned bacteria and archaea as prokaryotes, or maybe just prokarya. Though if you use this term today, people will still know that you're talking about bacteria and archaea. However, we try to avoid using this term because we now recognize that archaea and bacteria being very separate groups that deserve to each be their own domain. So today we refer to having these 3 domains. Eukarya can be broken down further into 4 different kingdoms. Plantae are plants, fungi, animalia, and our last one, because I ran out of room, I'm going to put down here, is our protists. It's kind of interesting that I ended up running out of room for the protists because they are one group, one of the kingdoms under eukarya that are the most difficult to classify. And we'll talk a little bit about protists later this week. You may want to refer to figure 26.3 for a breakdown of the hierarchical classification that takes the leopard, the common name leopard, but the scientific name is Panthera pardus. And how we break that down from its species, genus, family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, and ultimately domain. As just one example of how we take one species and how we break that into its larger components of its hierarchical classification. So let's talk about how organisms are placed into these different classes. Let's talk a little bit about how these organisms are placed within this hierarchical classification. And in a very general terms, the people who do this are called systemicists. Systemicists use a lot of different kinds of data to decide where different organisms fit within this hierarchical classification. They use morphological data. These include fossils, but can also come from living and existing organisms. And genetic data to help determine the evolutionary relationship of various organisms. They depict these relationships, these evolutionary relationships using something known as a phylogenetic tree. And so let's erase this here and let's draw a simple tree. And in doing so, we're going to go over some basic terms of a phylogenetic tree. So let's draw a phylogenetic tree with an order of organisms that we're all familiar with, the primates. And so let's go ahead and list 5 of these here. We have the gibbons, we have the orangutans, we have the gorillas, we have the chimpanzees, and for space I'm just going to write chimps, and then we have humans. And we're going to draw the tree like so. And we're going to identify some terms. And I guess we should write down here what we're looking at. This is a phylogenetic tree. And remember, phylogenetic trees are simply the hypothesis of how we believe different organisms are evolutionarily related. So let's go over some terms. At the tips of each of these branches here, we call these the taxa. That's the plural. The singular is taxon. Anything at the tip of these trees, the taxa, these are the organisms, the last known organisms of this branch. Sometimes, in this case here, these are all organisms that are alive today. But you could also show a phylogenetic tree where you would have the end of the lineage shown, where that organism, that species, eventually went extinct. Or in this case, orders, because these are the orders. Another term is called a branch. So that's a branch, that's a branch, that's a branch, and so is that. Anything that comes off the main lineage is called a branch. Next, at these branch points, here, here, and here, these are what we call nodes. Nodes represent common ancestors. So for instance, the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans is represented at this node here. The common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas is here. The common ancestor of orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and humans is here. And the common ancestor for all of these organisms within this order is right here. So it shows the evolutionary relationships of these organisms. We could say that humans and chimpanzees are more closely related to each other because they share a more recent common ancestor. We could also say that humans and gorillas are more closely related than humans and orangutans because they share a common ancestor here. Okay, now that we've looked at the phylogenetic tree, let's go ahead and look at this practice problem. When you see the problem, go ahead and hit pause so you can work through the problem and select an answer, and then you can hit play again and I'll walk through the problem with you, explaining what the correct answers are and what the incorrect answers are. Okay, well, if you chose A, you are in good company because this is a commonly missed answer. This is one of the broader misconceptions in looking at these trees. We want to, sometimes when we look at these, look at them in this order on the top, looking at the nodes, and assume that the lizard and crocodile, because they're next to each other, have to be more related than the crocodile to the bird, or the lizard to the bird. But the best way to read these trees is to look at a common ancestor. So the common ancestor of a crocodile and a bird is here. And so that means, just as a rule of thumb, that the crocodile is more closely related to a dinosaur and a bird than it is to anything below it, including the lizard. So I'll say that again. The crocodile here at this node is more related to anything further up the tree, the dinosaur and the bird, than it is to anything below the tree. Now let's move on to choice B. A crocodile is more closely related to a bird than to a lizard. This is choice B. And if you chose B, you are correct. This is the correct answer. So let's talk about this. Here's our crocodile. It's more closely related to a bird here than it is to a lizard. So this is saying the same thing here, just in reverse. And it's because, again, they share this common ancestor, the crocodile and the bird, and my phone just went off, chirping like a bird, so that was kind of coincidental. But they share this common ancestor, so anything upstream of it is going to be more related to it. Up the tree is more related to each other than anything below the tree. So a crocodile is more closely related to a bird than to a lizard. And this file, if you pick choice C, you were also wrong. Let me explain to you why C is incorrect. A crocodile is equally related to a lizard and a bird. But we can't say that because the crocodile and the bird share a common ancestor here, and the crocodile and a lizard share a common ancestor here. So that can't be correct. What we could have done to make this answer correct is we could have said a lizard is equally related to a crocodile and a bird. And I'm just going to write croc here. The reason we can say this is true, that a lizard is equally related to a crocodile and a bird, is because of this common ancestor. Both the crocodile and the bird, they share a common ancestor at this node here, which gave rise to the lizards. So they are equally related to both the crocodile and the bird. But as it was written here, it is incorrect. And D here, if you pick this one, it's also wrong. And it's wrong for a couple reasons. One, a crocodile, let's just read it. A crocodile is related to a lizard, but is not related to a bird. Well, this is a phylogenetic tree, and a phylogenetic tree shows evolutionary relationships to it. And so if it's on the same tree, then they have to be related. In addition, all living organisms are related if you go far enough back. I want to step away from the whiteboard for a moment now and show you this more complicated phylogenetic tree. It's a specialized one, and it's called a cladogram. For the purpose of this class, we're not going to need to know the distinction between a cladogram and a phylogenetic tree, but this is just another nice way of showing the evolutionary relationship between these organisms. Again, we have some similar terms that we saw before. All of these here, A through G, are taxa, and singularly taxon. We have our branch points here. We know by looking at these common branch points, the evolutionary relationships of these organisms. As it indicates here, this node represents the most recent common ancestor of A, B, and C, and we know that because we can take A and follow it back here to this point, B and follow it here, and C to here. So this is the most common recent ancestor of A, B, and C. Indeed, this branch point here is a common ancestor of A, B, and C too, but this is the most common recent ancestor. Likewise with D, E, and F, they share a common ancestor right here. So we could ask a question. We could say, what's the most common ancestor of taxon A and taxon F? Well, to figure that out, we just follow the lines until we come to a common branch point. So there's F as we start. And as we hit each branch point, we can ask, is it a common one? Do they share it? And it's not until we hit this branch point right here that we can confidently say that these two taxon, A and F, share a common ancestor. So this is the most recent common ancestor of A and F. And this one here is the most common recent ancestor of all A through G. Let's take a moment. I'm going to ask you two questions based on what we've learned about phylogenetic trees. The first one here is, which branch point on the phylogenetic tree represents the most recent common ancestor of chickens and frogs? Go ahead and hit pause and try to answer this question. Well, let's look at chickens and frogs here. We can see chicken and frog. And what we do is we follow these lines until we hit a common branch point. So when we hit our first node, we say, nope, they don't share that one. Our second node, we can say they don't share that one. Our next node here, they don't share it. So make sure we tell you to circle it. You don't circle this one and this one, but you go up to this point here where they intersect, where they meet. And so it's right here. So the answer is C. It is true that chickens and frogs share this common ancestor, and they share this common ancestor too. But C is the only one that is the most recent common ancestor. So we can get a lot of good information from phylogenetic trees, but we have to be careful because we can fall into some traps when we interpret them, because they can't tell us everything. The first thing we need to remember is that they show what we might call patterns of descent. They don't show phenotypic similarities. For instance, a bird and a lizard don't necessarily share many of the phenotypic similarities we might expect to see. But we know that their patterns of descent share a very close common ancestor. The second is that the sequence or the order of the branching, we'll write sequence of branching does not equal the age of the species. For instance, if we look at this figure 26.4 in your textbook, we cannot necessarily say that the gray wolf evolved before or after the European otter, the American badger. These trees do not show the specific age of when these species arose. You may think one of these species is more advanced based on what we think about them today, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are more recently derived. But it does tell us that the common ancestor of the wolf and the European otter, shown here by 1, that this most common ancestor did indeed live before the common ancestor of the coyote and gray wolf. That the coyote and gray wolf most common ancestor, this number 2, is more recent than the common ancestor of the wolf, gray wolf, and the otter. It does tell us that. But it does not tell us that the age of the gray wolf or the otter are any different. They could have arose at the same time. This tree does not indicate that. It only talks about the most common ancestors and the relatedness of those in terms of time. Third, adjacent taxa did not evolve from one or the other. Adjacent taxa represent their own distinct lineages and they share a common ancestor. Let's go back and look at figure 26-4 to explain exactly what I mean by this. We know that the gray wolf and the coyote had this common ancestor here where the number 2 is indicated. We should not assume that the gray wolf evolved from the coyote or the coyote evolved from the gray wolf. All we know for sure is that there was a common ancestor that gave rise to 2 lineages, both the coyote and the gray wolf. That this common ancestor of both the gray wolf and the coyote is no longer alive. But it did give rise to these two distinct lineages. Okay, this ends our first podcast for chapter 26, day 30. If you have any questions, please let us know. We'll see you in class. Bye.